Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Judson Memorial Church. My name is Micah, and I'm the senior minister here at Judson, and I'm so happy to see some new faces. I'm happy to definitely be up here with these folks because I know that in the midst of continuing disorienting times, I'm looking for prophets, historians, pastors, thinkers, people with deep, deep heart, and I don't think we can go wrong with the three people we have up here on this stage. So welcome to Judson. I cannot wait to learn from these three as I learn from them every single day, but having them all here as this nucleus of brain and heart trust right now in this space, we are about to have glitter bombs going out into the world and learn so much from you. So Benz and Andrew and Gary, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being here. Thank you who are joining us via live stream for being here. And let's get this show on the road.
All right, thank you, Micah. So welcome everyone here in the room and in the rooms across the world on the live stream to Setting a Larger Table, Creating a World of Economic, Racial, and Social Justice. We're here with Andrew Wilkes and Gary Dorrien, whom I will introduce in a moment. And my name is Dorothee Benz. My friends all call me Benz. And I'm a community minister here at Judson. This event is sponsored by the Religion and Socialism Working Group of the Democratic Socialists of America. I want to give a quick shout out to Maxine Phillips, who has worked tirelessly to pull this together. And of course, a special thanks to Judson Memorial Church for providing the space for us to co-create this space of justice tonight. A few words of sort of set the table for setting the table topic-wise, and then I will introduce our fabulous speakers. Setting a larger table as a topic could not be more urgent in this moment in the United States or across the world. And there are many different angles you could take on that. The lens that we're going to use tonight to look at it is a point of convergence for these two thinkers and authors and justice organizers, which is Black social Christianity with a Black social gospel. Gary has written 3 large books on this topic, but I'm going to attempt a very concise definition. Like its white counterpart, the Black social gospel is concerned with social, economic, and political justice, but obviously and necessarily centered on the claim of human dignity for African Americans and committed to the struggle for Black equality. It was born originally out of the betrayal of the abandonment of Reconstruction and has long provided a critical intellectual underpinning for civil rights movements in this country, and it is absolutely indispensable to any understanding of American movements for liberation, equality, and freedom. I want to emphasize at the outset that it is currently relevant and not just historically significant. And we will be centering its values in relation to questions of economic justice now, what's going on in Gaza, and so many other things, as much as we have time for. We're going to have a conversation for maybe roughly an hour, and then we will do some Q&A, and we will include you folks out in the ether in our Q&A. So put your questions in the chat, and they will be read into the room. And now to introduce our speakers. Andrew Wilkes is an author, political scientist, and pastor. Not necessarily in that order. I didn't ask which order. He is the co-pastor of the Double Love Experience Church in Brooklyn, author of the forthcoming Plenty Good Room, which is one of the books that will be centered in our discussion this evening. It will be out in June. Also co-author of Psalms for Black Lives, Reflections for the Work of Liberation, and author of Freedom Notes, Reflections on Faith, Justice, and the Possibility of Democracy. Gary Dorrien is the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary and the author of too many books to name. I'm sorry, Gary, I can't just spend the next half an hour listing them. Most relevant for our discussion this evening is his trilogy on the Black social gospel. The New Abolition, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel, Breaking White Supremacy, Martin Luther King and the Black Social Gospel, and A Darkly Radiant Vision, the Black Social Gospel in the Shadow of MLK. This last book, A Darkly Radiant Vision, is his most recent, published just last year, and that'll be the focus. It's not his most recent, I'm sorry. It's hard to keep up with him. Published in 2023, and that'll be the book that we're focusing on here, putting in conversation with Plenty Good Room. I'll also mention that Gary has a memoir coming out this fall. I've got about 10 questions on my list here, and if you do the math, that's like 3 or 4 minutes a question, and I really want to encourage us to kind of bounce back and forth. So if you try to keep your initial answers short, and then we can mix it up. I'm going to start with you, Andrew. By way of introducing us to the new book, Plenty Good Room, can you frame that central image for us, tell us its meaning, its relevance to this moment?
Thank you so much, Benz, and thank you all for being here and for streaming. Joy to be in conversation tonight. The full title of the book is Plenty Good Room, Co-Creating an Economy of Enough for All. And the title is derived from a Black church proverb that admits of various kinds of phrasings. One phrase is, there's plenty good room for all at the foot of the cross. Another way is, there's plenty good room in God's kingdom, God's reign, whatever one's preferred rendering of that is. That proverb is often taken to mean radical hospitality, a deep sense of invitation, and I want to say yay and amen to all of that, as well as setting alongside a deep sense of welcome, hospitality, and an invitational sort of component. I think there's an anti-scarcity conviction that's at the heart of Plenty Good Room, a sense of abundance, a sense of surplus, a sense of plenitude, and so Plenty Good Room is a metaphor to open up space beyond austerity politics, beyond zero-sum models of how we can share land, share labor, share resources, how we can do what some economists and activists are calling a solidarity economy as one way to kind of enter into this discussion. So that's what the title is about, and hopefully it is a capacious enough metaphor to stick beyond what just reverberates in my mind.
All right, thank you. I want to come back to the present, but first zoom out to sort of the 35,000-foot level and ask Gary to say something about the overall significance of the Black social gospel tradition in American politics. And I know that you have written well over 1,000 pages on this subject, and I'm looking kind of for the op-ed version, which is a tough assignment. But can you summarize for us this tradition and its significance to American politics?
No, not really. In fact, I think this just needs to be my longest response. All the rest, I don't have that much to say about all these other things you want to talk about, Benz, but for this one, I probably should just say, long before I even started writing these books, for 20 years, I sprinkled a counter-argument into many other books and articles about how we need a multi-volume work on the Black social gospel tradition. It just frustrated me that there was no literature on this enormously important tradition of thought and activism. That's both a church tradition and getting you out into an ordinary politics tradition. And I thought, I am not the one to write it, but I can certainly try to get someone to do so. And meanwhile, yes, I made this argument in numerous books over the years on a variety of subjects. Meanwhile, I had once I came to New York and had a beloved friend named James Cone, who is my closest friend at Union. kept saying to me, Gary, for God's sake, it's your obsession. Just start writing it. And that was the exhortation I needed to get rolling on what became the new abolition. And by then it felt like maybe it was too late, because now I'm in a health crisis. And I thought maybe I won't get through even that first volume. So it was the highlight of my career, despite all these other books. When that book reached page-proof stage, I thought, okay, at least that one, the foundational work that makes the argument about what this is, that is to say that the black social gospel is historically, it's a new abolition movement in a moment where there's a realization that we can't just keep giving that old abolitionist speech and sermon and song. Indeed, abolition has come and gone. The Civil War has come and gone. And now we're in a situation where we're having to ask the terrible question of what would a new abolition be now in a context of this mania of lynching that's going on. And the 14th and 15th and 16th Amendment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments are being eviscerated barely 20 minutes after they've been passed. And the troops have been pulled out, and and so they've given up on Reconstruction, and now we're in a moment politically that's like no other from past or what you're looking into. That's the black social gospel having to ask that question and to say churches need to be involved in ordinary struggles for social justice in a way that we have not been, in a way that actually no churches really ever have been, except what? Except that abolitionist movement that we've just come through. That's the only real thing from the past that this movement could say. So you always have a struggle in the churches, not just in black churches, but of course in white middle-class churches, where there's such a thing called the social gospel movement, and they have a similar argument there, where people say, the church isn't involved in justice or politics or any such thing. When has the church ever been that? And the response, it had to be, justice is in the gospel. We need to be involved in struggles for justice. And indeed, there's at least something from our rememberable past, where in which the churches did it to some degree. And so this social gospel is, in fact, it is a new abolitionism. In fact, the NAACP would have been called the New Abolition Movement. That's what the people who founded the NAACP wanted to call it, including Du Bois. But they realized, every time they had this argument, that just came to the same impasse. If we call it that, we'll never get a single Southern chapter. So we can't call it that. And so they ended up with that mouthful that nobody really liked, but settled for. And the black social gospel is though, among other things, it is those figures in the orbit of Du Bois who are church pastors, who were lost to history because people weren't asking, well, what was the social gospel in black churches? And if you don't ask the question, then, there's just a lack of certain curiosity about what you might have learned. Or just ask the question, where did Martin Luther King Jr. come from? To ask that question should take you to the black social gospel. But instead, there are all these reasons why people said, oh, no, that didn't exist. Social gospel is just a white thing. It's just, it's just about white progressivism. It's not about racial justice. And black churches are too conservative and insular to be involved in that. And four other things I won't go into. But then one more at the end. The last one was always, plus, Reinhold Niebuhr shredded the social gospel, so that's not a usable history. We can't go back to that. So when I finally wrote The New Abolition, I did have to write a table-setting chapter at the outset that just knocked down all these conventions in the field about why there was no black social gospel tradition, and to argue that, no, it's actually the most important religious tradition we have in this country, and we're way overdue to have literature about it.
The most important religious tradition we have in this country. Yes. So thank you for setting that up for us. I want to take that background and now bring it back to the present moment and ask you, Andrew, in your capacity, particularly as a pastor, the Double Love Experience Church calls itself a Jesus movement committed to Black lives. So I want to ask, what does that look like on the ground, and how is the Jesus movement part of that relevant to BLM?
Absolutely. Excited to respond to that, and also want to lean into what Gary mentioned earlier in terms of Black social gospel being such a key religious tradition. Just by sharing a bit of my own story, the first chapter of Playing a Good Room is called Interrogating Our Origins. And I talk about how our origin story, where we grew up, the kind of social, political climates in which we come of age and begin to develop our politics, has a lot to do with whether we view justice in roomier ways where we can form extensive coalitions, or whether we view justice in a way that is perhaps needlessly parochial. And so my own story, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and my home pastor taught religion and philosophy, and still does, at Morehouse for 20, 25 plus years. And from that experience, I developed a deep appreciation for how my own, I guess, particular appreciation of the Black social gospel is that it's a tradition that perhaps maybe begins in Christianity, but welcomes the contributions and the insights of other traditions. One of the most formative texts I remember reading as a teenager was Gandhi's The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And this notion of satyagraha, which of course, soul force that King weaves with his understanding of what it looks like to make the religion of Jesus real, I think speaks to what it means for a generous practice of Christian faith itself to have Playing a Good Room, rather than having a domineering religious position relative to other faith traditions. What does it look like for Christian faith? And I don't want to overread the tradition. I don't know if what I'm saying is a consensus position in the Black social gospel, but certainly my own understanding of the tradition is one that takes being a religious neighbor rather than trying to be a religious conquistador seriously. So rather than trying to have the kind of exclusivist soteriology and it's a particular understanding of Christ or else, a practice of the religion of Jesus that accents Matthew not only 25, but Matthew 23, right? Which talks about the weightier matters of the law being mercy, faithfulness, and justice. So deep kind of Christian identity that brings in other religious traditions, brings in political traditions as a polycentric core was key for me. And in terms of the, thank you so much. In terms of the Jesus movement for Black lives dimension, a similar kind of component. Every Sunday we kind of ground ourselves in a sense of kind of mission and vision. Among those things, talking about an equitable economy for all of God's creation, a spirit-led mysticism, an emphasis on personal and public health. These are things that are ideals, are norms that are too big for any one congregation, any one religious tradition, any one labor union, any one strand of socialism, any one strand of autonomous or mutual aid politics to do alone. And so I see the connection to the movement for Black lives. Sometimes it takes me the scenic way around than the linear way. So we can journey together. I see the connection there. And a few folks within the movement for Black lives that have made, and organizations, a strong link in terms of class, in terms of labor. I think of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, where Taylor's talking about the strike for Black lives and having a deep sense of economic justice that values worker rights at the core. That for us is very much something that has been central. And so we'll maybe land the plane by saying, I think a part of maybe the deepest hope of Playing a Good Room and a part of the kind of Jesus movement for Black lives piece is, I once heard Howard Thurman, this was on the Boston University archives of Okay, wonderful. There's a very rich image of Christ as a labor union leader. And the idea of Jesus, not just as revolutionary, which sometimes we hear, not just as rabble-rouser, but Jesus as a labor union leader, I think is a really fertile, under-theorized kind of Christology that is necessarily open. Even though labor unions themselves may not always necessarily be open, there's the potential for it to be so. And so the sense of Jesus as a day laborer who is bringing together folks who in some regards could be seen as kind of walking off their jobs, pooling together resources in order to advance a kind of beloved community is what undergirds some of the work in the congregation.
That's amazing. I want to ask Gary, I'm going to jump around a little bit from what I sent you guys, to follow up on that and pull us back for a moment to Martin Luther King's emphasis on economic justice that has so been sanitized out in neoliberalism.
Oh, thank you. I love this question. Firstly, King was trained at Morehouse College and Crozier Seminary and Boston University School of Theology. So the first thing to just say about this subject is that even though Daddy King, his father, is a raving capitalist version of a black social gospeler, and who didn't care at all for some of the books that his son was bringing home during his school days, King just assumed from his school days onward that the social gospel, that social Christianity, its social ethics itself, at its best, is of course a Christian socialist tradition. To him, this is just ABC. It's just not even really arguable. That this is a story about, Walter Rauschenbusch and Mordecai Johnson and people like that who just represent something that he, so far as that is concerned, is continuing. That is a critique of economic injustice, an assumption, a kind of Rauschenbusch argument about how that political democracy and extreme concentrations of wealth are simply incompatible, and if you don't break down extreme concentrations of wealth, then you won't be able to have political democracy anyway, because the rich will just end up owning the system. So the idea that political democracy is a kind of uncashed promissory note, which is a theme that King does get from Rauschenbusch about how one needs to lead to the other, that we need to make gains toward economic democracy just to even be able to hold on to the amount of political democracy we already have, much less to get any more of it in a country that's already just has such deep cleavages, so deeply unjust. So there just was never a time in King's own seminary career or getting his doctorate or then entering the ministry or the whole time then he was in the movement when he didn't take that for granted. The conflict for him is, how much can I talk about it? How can he even talk about being a flat-out democratic socialist? Maxine and I we're close to Michael Harrington. Some of the early stuff I know about this, what's in my head on this, is Mike talking about when he first realized that King has the very same democratic socialist worldview that he has about economic justice. And at first he said it just frightened him to say, oh my God, this can't get out. And this is then becomes Mike's introduction to realizing, oh yeah, Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and Farmer and all this whole group of people around King, they all know this about him and they agree, yeah, this can't get out. It would cause irreparable harm to the movement if the leader of the civil rights movement, if his belief in democratic socialism that is actually grounded in a worldview were known. This can't get out. So how can you talk about it in ways that you can get by with, that you can talk about without sort of naming it ideologically? Dr. King struggled with that till his dying day, and he would say things when at the SCLC meetings, when you got a gathering of lieutenants, there would be times to say, turn off that tape recorder, and often when it was, the injunction was to turn off the tape recorder, that meant he was going to go into this kind of thing, and would say to them, if you quote me on this subject, I'm going to have to deny it. And they got that. Of course they got it. They went through a version of this when he came out against the Vietnam War, because that's the same thing, just with regard to the militarism issue. He struggled with his conscience for 3 years before he finally gives the Riverside Address and now becomes an anti-war leader. And that just rocked the whole movement, because virtually everyone around him wanted him not to give that speech, to the extent that he had to find 2 outsiders to actually write it, because none of his usual speechwriters were willing even to help him to write it.
Let's just maybe hop in briefly on that question. A couple things. One, I had the pleasure of many moons ago, when I had hair on my head and I was a younger man, serving as the executive director of the Drum Major Institute, which is a group that Martin Luther King Jr. and one of his lawyers, Harry Wattell, founded. Then the sons of the founders got it back up and moving. And during that time, I had the chance to work with MLK III and with Andrew Young, and a part of the sense that one gets from being around folks who were around King, particularly Young, is that exactly to your point, Gary, that it was kind of known. So there's the story one can tell from the Stanford papers about King's politics. There's the story we could tell about King speaking to the New York Times and saying that we're engaged in a kind of class struggle. So you see it kind of seep out, these sort of moments. But just wanted to share the kind of interpersonal dimension that sometimes you can sense as well about King's politics.
Yeah, I want to follow that up with a couple of things that you wrote in Plenty Good Room. But first, just a final comment on that piece of King's legacy. This can't get out. That, that sort of, that sense of that. Is that the Cold War, or is that more than the Cold War that's makes that so dangerous for the movement?
Language about socialism is, of course, deeply problematic for figures in our tradition, the folks we're looking at here anyway. I mean, it's hard enough to be black in this country without sort of taking that on as well. And this is said over and over within the circle of the people I'm writing about in the new Abolition. I mean, there are my favorite figures in that book, of course, are Reverdy Ransom and George Woodby and George Slater. It's that socialist tradition. And so, of course, I'm cheering for them. But, of course, the first responsibility when you tell a story like this is first you've got to get the history right. And this explicitly democratic socialist wing of the new abolition movement, that's the black social gospel, certainly in that first generation and even the second one, this is always a minority current within that. There's a similar, just even at a little bit larger level, Du Bois himself. Du Bois is a democratic socialist, although he didn't read Marx until the 1920s. But he's a democratic socialist from about 1908 onward. But then the NACP, every meeting they had at the Board of Governors meeting every month was an argument about that, because they can see that Du Bois is getting that kind of thing in Crisis Magazine. And a lot of these, white and black liberals who were on the board, they don't like that stuff. All those Howard University professors, half of whom are economists, not a socialist in the bunch. So the whole argument about, an argument about democratic socialism and, oh, no, it isn't what you think, and it isn't communism, and all that stuff that you have to get into as soon as you say the S word, that was all there's enough controversy and difficulty about that long before you even get to the Cold War. And then, of course, with the Cold War, now we've got the entire planet divided, two ways. And yes, everything is at stake, sort of at what side you're on, to the extent that I can remember when there were only a couple of books out there about Du Bois, except from the old left, a monthly review, and like the Pathfinder Press, they would keep Du Bois in print, but otherwise you just couldn't touch him because, of course, he had ended up in the CP. And that, for a time, during the last period of the Cold War, it just made you untouchable. The Berlin Wall really had to come down before this revival, this recovery of the sheer greatness of Du Bois was even possible on the scale that it's become. So yes, it's both. I mean, there's trouble enough already before you hit the Cold War, but then when that comes along, now it's just hopelessly difficult. And so it is the case that those people, that handful of people who actually created the March on Washington, every one of them a Democratic Socialist, and yet the one who's not kind of out as such is king, and every one of them needed to keep it that way, because indeed this can't get out.
Thank you. I want to read a passage that I find just very moving from Plenty Good Room, from the introduction, and then ask, hopefully a coherent question. As a political scientist, this is Andrew's words now, as a political scientist, I have studied political theory, economic theory, public policy, and democratic socialism. As a pastor, I have delivered eulogies at funerals and buried people who shouldn't have died. I have counseled people who should still have their jobs. From my labors in both fields, I have found that democratic socialism, as one current in the larger river of the Black freedom struggle, offers an imperfect yet important way of pursuing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. I just think that's beautiful. And then over on the next page, in talking about this book as a countervision to a lot of the inherited conservatism and, I guess, commitment to capitalism. You talk about a countervision to those who hear, and this is the phrase I want to share, entire theories of economic justice built on the slender reeds of Bible verses wrenched from their literary and historical context. So I want to bring that back to the Black social gospel tradition on the ground in the churches. Talk a little bit about like those slender reeds and what the struggle against that is. And just to add to that was a quote from Angela Davis that I heard in some speech of, I forget for which class. I was listening to this beautiful speech that she gave in Barcelona, and at one point when she's talking about capitalism, she says, capitalism is racial capitalism, right? Which, you know that, but when it's said so clearly, so that the struggle for economic justice and the struggle for political freedom, especially for African Americans, have to be connected. So, take it from there.
No, but appreciate that question, and thank you for your gracious words and reading from Plenty Good Room. Racial capitalism, I'll start there and then try to work my way around from there. Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxism, The Makings of the Black Radical Tradition, argues that race and capitalism are intertwined from the beginning, so much so that Robinson's account of how capitalism consolidates and emerges in England is built on a kind of racialization between the English and the Irish. And so we see this kind of racialization move in part. So Robinson argues, his position is not consensus, but I think he makes a compelling case, and I, as you probably can hear me narrating it, kind of side a bit with Robinson on this front. We see capitalism differentiating populations and doing its work of extraction and exploitation along the lines of race, even before we get to the transatlantic slave trade in earnest. So I want to say that to kind of connect what you mentioned about Angela Davis. And in terms of the kind of slender reeds of economic theory and modes of what congregational action looks like in the world, whether that's from churches, from synagogues, from mosques, what have you, there are verses like the poor you will always have with you. There are verses from 1 Thessalonians that sometimes are sometimes lifted up by those who appeal to the Bible to kind of maybe buttress or legitimate their particular perspectives. If you don't work, you don't eat. Is that a passage folks have heard from 1 Thessalonians? So a part of what I have found helpful is not to engage in full-out proof texting, but also not to cede the reception and meaning-making of Scripture to those who want to mobilize the Bible or any other text, for that matter, in more revanchist, harmful directions. And in that regard, I've always found Mary's Magnificat to be an important intervention for a number of reasons. One, because the Black social gospel tradition, in my judgment, is too swashbuckling and masculinist in some regards. And so often you hear, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to announce the acceptable year of the Lord's favor, to bind up the brokenhearted, set the captives free, set at liberty the oppressed. That's a beautiful vision. It's an ethical vision. It's a deeply political vision. But I'd like to suggest rhetorically that Jesus gets it from his mama in some ways. Because in Mary's Magnificat, we see in Luke 1, just a few passages before, and this is what I found is sometimes helpful in engaging in counter narratives and alternative readings of Scripture. In this case, just plainly reading. The hungry will be filled with good things, and the rich will be sent away empty, that the mighty will be pulled down from their thrones, and the humble will be exalted. This vision of social reversal, very prominent among Latin American liberation theologians, not as often lifted up in Black social gospel context. And so I think beginning with the Magnificat and then going to Luke 4, among other passages, is one way that I've found to kind of help frame out, sign-on letters for living wage campaigns and affordable housing efforts, so on and so forth. And in appealing to the use of Scripture in ways that use it as one braid and one strand among other strands, I think is an important way to argue in public so that those who come to the Bible can see themselves. But there may be folks who do politics, do justice work from reflection on personal experience. I think that's important. I think that's valid, and also needs to be a strand that we tie into the work. There are those who will appeal to your Engels, your Marx, your Rosa Luxemburgs, your I often love to bring Alice Walker into the conversation. There's a beautiful ecological poem called Democratic Socialist Womanism. And the womanist tradition has an undernamed anti-capitalist dimension that I talk about in Plenty Good Room. Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, of course, is where we began with that tradition, that kind of fourfold definition of womanism. And so I mentioned the poem and Walker's Politics as a way to kind of point to one among others. We could point to the last chapter as well of Katie Cannon's Womanism and the Soul of Community, where she talks about race and class, pulling from the sociologist Oliver Cromwell Crocs, who talks a little bit about that work as well. And so maybe a way to maybe land this particular point in terms of how to really make a more frontal case for beloved community. One of the things that I try to do in Playing Good Room, and I think remains particularly important to do now at a moment where, can I be blunt? Is that all right? One of the ways that racial capitalism legitimates itself is through, it's not the only way, but one of the ways. We on the same page. One of the ways is having a language of racial justice that is, in fact, black capitalism, one. Two, that has a kind of law and order vision, but that makes a patina of an appeal to civil rights in order to present it to the electorate in ways that feel plausible. And I want to suggest that when we consider the ways that Lori Lightfoot's politics work in Chicago, the way that Eric Adams' politics work right now in New York City, the way that Andre Dickens' politics work in Atlanta, how else can we explain each of these folks? I particularly want to talk about Adams and Dickens appealing to the civil rights movement, appealing to racial justice at the precise same time that the largest police training facility in the country is being built in the same city of the Atlanta Student Human Rights Movement, the same city where SNCC was headquartered, the same city where SCLC was headquartered. You get that when racial reasoning and capitalism and the law is trotted out in ways that are coercive and that use race in a kind of like essentializing way that kind of occludes and makes opaque different traditions of arguing from race, arguing about class, arguing about, in David Harvey's terms, who has a right to the city. And so calling on the deep anti-capitalist, in some case, socialist dimensions of womanist theological and theoethical traditions, and calling on a vision of the black freedom struggle that pushes against some of what I think we see happening that is lamentably appears to be quite electable politics, is a way of hopefully trying to turn the tide in exactly generously, but also clearly in the exact opposite direction.
You have just hit on like three of the questions that I don't know where to go first. I want to talk about womanism. I want to talk about black feminist methodology and how much promise it has and its connection to the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to talk about Gaza and Atlanta and Cop City. Okay, but I'm going to hold that. Because I also want to ask Gary to say a word.
Maybe we could continue with something.
Okay.
Right here, yeah?
All right, let's.
Because we didn't get you didn't send us those middle chapters, so we're just sitting here guessing.
I know, that's
and
true.
Then I was like, oh, yeah, all right, we're definitely hooked.
Right,
no.
yeah, so this book is out in June, everybody,
Yes.
right? And Andrew sent us the introduction and the epilogue, so we're just
That's
hanging on like
That's
all
right.
this stuff. So
Contrition.
But I think one of those questions you just named, I mean, you just went for something that rather than lose it, let's just stick with it for a moment. It's said all the time, womanism has a hard time getting political. And it's too communal and too, much of people just sort of getting along and being communal. And the argument is that the prior black feminist tradition actually was better at this, more hard-nosed in terms of actually getting political. Also, because that was the case, also you could trust it a little more with regard to LGBTQ everything, especially as it gets political. All right, so I'm just setting you up here because it sounds like you are pushing back and saying, actually, whatever looks like it might be true on the surface, there are actually sort of deep sources in the womanist tradition that do get political and that in fact aren't subject to where this critique just isn't true. And so that it's actually more like the black feminist tradition than what a lot of those anthologies out there say right now. So go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Apparently you have a whole chapter on this, so go for it.
I don't have a whole chapter on it, but a portion of the work deals with that. And again, please accept my profoundest lament and contrition on that front. I think it's important, and what I attempt to do is to talk about how I mentioned Alice Walker and Katie Cannon, so we'll maybe return to them a bit. Their work recognizes and calls out how ecological devastation and capitalism undermine that work of public health and healing of entire communities and populations that Walker sets out in search of our mother's gardens. And if there's any critiques among many that can be made of socialist traditions, oftentimes they are not as inclusive, not as intersectional and indivisible on questions of gender and gender identity, not always as strong on questions of race, and not always as strong on questions of empire. And so in lifting up Cannon and Walker's work, and also Dolores Williams' work, who has a really strong anti-capitalist commitment that flows throughout Dolores Williams' sense of Jesus' ministerial vision. I can remember from around 94, 95, there was an article in Sojourners that had a piece by Cornel West and a piece by Dolores Williams where they're talking about issues of economics and justice. And you see, granted, West comes from a sort of philosophical and prophetic pragmatist view, but nevertheless, squarely within a kind of faith-rooted Black freedom struggle, and Dolores Williams kind of laying out a theoethical vision of resources for contesting the regime of capitalism in ways that do carry forward the kind of Black feminist tradition that you talk about, Gary, and also invite us to reconsider some of the different strands and streams of womanism as a project that hopefully in this iteration of the Black social gospel and other faith traditions and ethical traditions leaning into this kind of work, we can accent a bit more than, because I said I was going to be candid, the tradition of King and Wyatt T. Walker and Hosea Williams is a deeply gendered patriarchal tradition. And to the extent that it's gendered and patriarchal, and perhaps it would have changed had King lived longer, but we have to deal with the record such as we have it, right? It constrains and circumscribes the plenty good room that we could have if we had a more robust vision of what socialism and what the different ways to texture and nuance what we mean when we talk about social justice.
Gary, do you want to add to that, or do you want me to keep going?
I have no need to, no.
Okay.
It's wonderful. I just wanted to find out what indeed was in these middle chapters.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So I want to bounce off of that, and and I've always understood the womanist tradition to be political, and I've never seen, and this may be a deficit on my part and a lack of scholarship, I've never seen such a big divide between Black feminist methodology and womanism. And so I'm going to call it Black feminist methodology, but trying to embrace both traditions, to say that the thing that methodology put on the table, to be able to look at multiple systems of oppression and social location, but doing so in a way that doesn't limit it to a social location, that really understands the interconnection between the struggles. Where I have seen the fruit of that in the modern Black Lives Matter movement, which from jump has been intersectional, like in its DNA, has been, if you look at the platform of the Movement for Black Lives, like everything that it covers, like understanding the issue. Palestine is in there. They name Israeli genocide in that platform, and that is 8 years ago, right? They name LGBTQ rights as integral to the black struggle. It is a new era and a new generation of black freedom struggle that I feel like is built, whether it's named that way, on black feminist methodology, and I think it's wonderful. I want to jump from that with the connection of how everything is interconnected over to Gaza, but Gary's going to say something first.
Yeah, I think before we sail past what you just said, Benz, you should just mark, I mean, this is a real discussion about black feminism and womanism. You know, Bell Hooks said this till the day we lost her, that this womanist thing just should not have happened, that it got in the way, it slowed us down, it turned too much of a discourse into a Southern female discourse that's just privileging the tropes of a too particular culture. Usually has some kind of grandmother story that she didn't have, and she said, "I'm sorry, nobody polices me. I'm a black feminist." Not that. She saw it as a kind of policing move that she couldn't identify with. And there are plenty of other. We don't need to name all the people who love Bell Hooks who kind of make a similar kind of argument of that sort. So this has been there's been a rather considerable discussion within the field all along. And of course, when we hit, third wave of womanism, that's what Monica Coleman said as well, is that if I am a womanist, it has to be on terms that I'm about to define that are more like something of an earlier time, not this tradition that is so communal and definitely church-based. And that was the second thing, not just communal of a certain sort, but there was the whole question about the church, its church identification being too limiting. Well, it's a strength, actually, except for those for whom it isn't. And so now you're going to get two different kinds of womanism that just come from that issue alone, very church-oriented or not. Because now, indeed, you do have, two different things just with regard to that issue.
Just one more quick point on this. Though this is not in the book, just want to name a sense of intellectual indebtedness. Reverend Dr. Carrie Day has long been and continues to be a seminal influence for me, and has a great text, Womanist and Feminist Responses to Neoliberalism, which I think is an attempt to maybe try to bring some of the best of these strands together, to your point, and push back against neoliberalism culturally, ideologically, and in terms of a kind of practice-based, movement-based view of the kind of political work of love.
Yeah, and I heard you say earlier this evening, and very clearly in the book, like more or less it takes all of us, right? We cannot afford to have pure politics and to exclude somebody with a slightly different pedigree of political thinking. And I think to that extent, bring on the womanists, bring on the black feminists, bring them all, because it really is an all hands on deck kind of an era. I want to come back to that also, but to the point that I was going to bounce off of from Black Lives Matter and its holistic, intersectional, understanding the connections thing. You and I were talking about this yesterday, Andrew. We were talking about Gaza, and then the literal connection between the state violence that's being perpetrated there and the state violence that's being perpetrated here, and we were talking about Atlanta and specifically. So the building of Cop City, which is intended to be this heavily militarized training ground for police forces in the U.S., with a vision and I believe a contract on the books for the IDF, for the Israeli Defense Forces, to be training American cops to do their business here, while at the same time on the campus of Emory, you have cops busting heads. So the global coordinated, connected assault on black and brown bodies in particular, by police forces that are all interconnected, and how, you know, the slogan, Palestine will set us free, I finally understood that. Because when we see that connection, we see that our liberation is indeed completely tied up in each other. And I wonder if you could say some more about that, because I know we were talking about it yesterday.
Happy to say some more about that, and to maybe talk about it from some dimensions we haven't yet covered. The building of Cop City in Atlanta is not only a doubling down and trying to invest overtime in militarized policing, but it's also removing some of the beauty of the earth that could help us deal with climate change. Having treescapes helps to serve as a mitigating force on some of the worst effects of climate change. And so the environmental justice and the ecological commitment, which is as tied to the question of pushing back against police violence and a number of other things we might point to, throwing out signatures in Atlanta. And I should also know, I want to try to say this as fairly and delicately as possible. There is a very prominent senator who's associated with the Black freedom struggle, whose positions have been, who is in an objectively difficult to navigate position. I want to be generous and start there, one. Two, whose positions have been elliptical. Is that a generous way of putting it? Elliptical on questions of Cop City and the intertwined social evils that it reflects. And so the connection between that and Gaza is that not only are we seeing what's happening at Emory in terms of rubber bullets and more and worse taking place, but you also have a place like Georgia State, which is Georgia State University, a key proponent of Cop City, as well as a training ground for the Israeli Defense Force, and doing policy transfer, some of those methods being shared with the Atlanta Police Department. And so there is a kind of transatlantic policy transfer of coercion and repression that's not only happening in Atlanta, but we see some connections that many activists have made in terms of how the New York City Police Department trains and where it derives, not all, but part of its methodologies from. And so I say those things because I think it's important for, to say plenty good room, I don't think means we avoid having difficult conversations about how each of us, and by each of us I mean all of us, myself included, have more room to grow, have more room to stretch. And I think having conversations that wade into dissonance from a place of our movements to have genuine, durable solidarity have to be able to hold some of those tough conversations.
Gary, do you want to get in on the Gaza question?
Well, I think the plenty good room metaphor does apply here to the relation of political movements that and political groups like DSA that are involved in organizing, different kinds of organizing, including ordinary electoral work that actually ends up electing people. And so now we have folks within our circle who end up, who actually now are getting elected to things, and now they're in a spot that we're all, we squirm here because we realize how just objectively difficult it is, and there's a certain almost hubris that can come from feeling that, well, we got you elected, we expect more from you, and yet it immediately can and does expose how weak we still are when people who are our friends and get elected then find that they've actually got very little ballast to their left and all the pressure is coming from somewhere else. And which way do you think that's going to go, at least on certain issues, when that's the dynamic? And then we're in the difficult position of how do we kind of hold on to our friends and hold them up and have their back. At the same time, we need to be stronger and actually give them a ballast to kind of pull them the ways on things that we care about. And to the extent that sometimes we can't on things we care about, it's because we're just not strong in the ways that we think we must be by now, because look, we've got friends in office. And just to go to a slightly more comfortable version of a similar thing, here in DSA, if you know, anyway, this is a DSA crowd, you know, 2 or 3 times a year we have a big controversy about groups in DSA who are signing long lists about who want to throw AOC out of DSA. You know, we got to expel her because she failed to pass some litmus test, And about a year ago, when we were in a similar place, I mean, it's not like, I don't think there isn't something to protest against here, but I felt like I was barely hanging on. A bunch of my friends, people of my age, been DSA and DSOC going back 40, 50 years, they have left over this. And some of us who are still here, it's like almost have to justify, certainly to our friends, how come we're still here? And indeed, I have felt a couple of times, well, if they actually do it, if they expel AOC, that might actually be it for me. And it is a way of sort of naming in a way that's a little more comfortable for us than what we were just talking about here. The same thing, right?
This is deft and generous of you to reroute while we're talking about the same thing in a different context. I think perhaps it is fair to say that we do need to hold on to our friends, whoever they may be, and to put it in state senate terms, there's the Farrah Savants, there's the Jabari Brisports, there's a ton of folks that are on the slate now who we will inevitably want to support and to be their ballast on the left. And I just say that to bring in multiple different roles here in New York State as well. It would seem to me that it is possible to generously, and not with the intent to discard or demean or to drag people's reputations through the mud, to encourage, let's pick something like, you know, good cause eviction or the New York Health Act, to encourage particular position taking and movement in that direction, even as we acknowledge that we don't yet have like all of the votes and all of the constituency that we need. I guess my question is, we can do both at the same time if the nudge is benevolent and to shift directionality rather than to kind of litmus test, as your name, which I agree with you. I don't think we want to litmus test in that kind of way.
Agreed. Let me go in a slightly different direction. Again, sort of using the slaughter in Gaza as a jumping off point. And watching, you know, the United States arm and fund and cheerlead, and, you know, and it needs to be said that is largely a bipartisan consensus, and then watching the resistance here in solidarity with the resistance in Gaza and in Palestine, and people, you know, I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of people getting arrested every single day at some event in Washington, at some event in New York, at a fundraiser here, at a cultural institution there, at a, you know, a media outlet over there, over and over and over again. And then these student encampments that have seemingly sprung up, although they'd not sprung out of thin air. They came out of months and months and months of organizing and other steps that preceded them, but now they've sort of made it onto the main stage, met with so much state violence. I mean, classic nonviolent tactics of, sit-in, encampment, call for divestment. I mean, it doesn't get more sort of classically nonviolent. Met with tear gas and batons and rubber bullets and all of it seeming to make no difference, right? I mean, anti-Semitism is weaponized, and just, wholesale made up stories about people and things. And meanwhile, Zionists are driving their cars into protesters and things. I mean, it can be very despairing. It can be very, to see how much is, how hard we're fighting and how much repression is brought against it and how little difference it seems to make. So the question I want to ask from all of that, there's two questions I want to ask, but the first one is what does Black social Christianity have to say to that moment? What wisdom do we bring from that tradition to this experience?
Really great question. The first thing I would note is I would maybe say I don't think there's maybe all the difference that we may want to see, for sure. We're not yet at a lasting ceasefire. We're not yet at the end of occupation in Palestine. But there have been some shifts that have happened, even if shifts in public presentation, whether it's Vice President Harris has begun to talk about a temporary ceasefire in Selma in ways that were not even mentioned at the tail end of 2023. Haven't had a chance to wade into the particulars, but I think I saw today or maybe yesterday that Biden is talking about pausing shipment of munitions and weapons. How extensive, what precisely the details are, not yet sure. But for certain, I think it's probably fair to say that that's a bit of a response to encampments. It's a response to student organizing, response to pressure. And I really appreciate and am instructed by, I'll go further and say, the heart of what I think Gary is calling us to, which is recognizing the difficulty of, on the one hand, I want to agree with you, Benz, and note that there may be, is more that we want to see, more that we're dreaming, more that we envision. But also, it's not that there's nothing that has taken place, if that makes sense. And acknowledging the room for maneuver and holding close those who are disposed to agree, and who, in fact, their works speaks in spades to that, is precisely the spirit that's at the heart of the Black social gospel, I think, in its best moments. It's also something that I think we all may have seen from the poet Aja Monet, that's on the front plaster of this church, where it says, "Our hearts are big enough to feel solidarity." Did folks see that walking in here on Thompson Street? All right, well, I invite you to see it for those who are with us in person rather than virtually on your way. It's a beautiful testament to how we can hold enough capacity for striking common cause and fellow feeling in a way that transcends borders and that transcends some of the fractiousness that sometimes undermines the good that we would do and would accomplish on the left.
Well, I too am desperate even to find something to hold, some shard of something to hold on to, say, see, there's something to hope for here. It could be worse. It could yet get better. And there's a little opening, something like that, because it's just the sheer horror of what's in front of us and has been now for months is just too much to bear, to really hold. And there's just this immediate imperative just to whatever you can to try to stop this just slaughter of people and kind of pulverization of their homes and hospitals and schools and just everything that's just physically there, that was there in Gaza. But it's reached this point of desperation, and now, entering a kind of starvation phase that is what words do you even have for it? And yet we're in a moment right now. I mean, because you have to hope and pray, and also you exert whatever influence we have on legislators and Biden and all the rest of it to say it could stop here. It doesn't need to go further from here, because indeed it's right in front of us what could still happen even this next week if that's the way it goes. So I think you can't despair. You can't give in to the despair of all that's in it and around it. But this is a very, very low point right now. I've been a mainstay of the Tikkun group for many years. Tikkun Institute, Network of Spiritual Progressives, Tikkun Magazine, all these things. I've written many, many times for Tikkun. Michael's a dear friend of mine, Michael Lerner. One of the things that we can hold on to is this two historic peoples with historic narratives need to find a way to share the land and respect each other's right to self-determination, and there's no way out that doesn't begin there. I've said it for 50 years and signed all manner of petitions that say it, and I still believe it. But I can remember times when it felt like it was within grasp. And so now to be in a moment where it just feels like that dream just lies shattered across all of Israel and Palestine, it's just very hard, very, very hard time.
Yes, it is. And with that, I think what I want to ask as a kind of closing question, and I mean this in the most theological way possible, is what is it that gives you hope, especially in confronting something like the slaughter in Gaza and the seeming intractability of so much resistance and no end to it, and looking at police violence and looking at devastating social inequality. I mean, there's so many things we could list, right? But where does hope come from? And understanding that hope is not optimism, right? Where do we find hope theologically? That's what I want to send us out with.
Well, I know what it is for me, actually. I mean, I do love the work, God help me, I do. And I love the company that comes with it, and I know that I don't have any capacity on my own to sustain the hope that's held me all these years. But I've never been without it because of the company that comes. And this is something many years now out in the speaking trail, mostly speaking in churches, since that's what most of what I've done. I mean, the kinds of speaking venues I've deliberately had for most of my career involves me being in some small church or another from one weekend to the next. And when I get the person raising their hand saying, how do you even hang in sort of doing this? And I say, well, are you a member of this community? Usually when someone asks that, they have no idea how you hang in there. It's because, in fact, they're just considering the work, but they don't have the company yet, haven't actually done it, and so haven't found out the blessings that come from being involved in others' with the work, within it. But to me, you can't get more theological than that. And that is the answer. It's not like there's another thing on a list. That is it.
Would lift up, I think a poem comes to mind, one from Langston Hughes, and I think poems sometimes help us to express and emote theologically when traditional prose doesn't quite do what we might want for it to do. This is, I would suggest, maybe latently theological. It is not explicitly so, but I appreciate it from Hughes, even though Hughes might not necessarily go where I'm trying to go with this. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird no longer to fly. Hold fast to dreams. Hughes rhapsodizes, for if dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. And this idea of holding fast to dreams, I think is akin to holding on to hope. And Martin King has an image that I sit alongside Hughes stanzas where King talks about hewing, chiseling, hewing out of the mountain of despair. We certainly have reasons for despair. We have reasons for cynicism, and lamentably, the reasons are rather persuasive. But nevertheless, hewing, kind of a strenuous metaphor, right? Hewing out of the stone of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. And I think the stones of hope, theologically, may be prayer, may be poetry, may be breath work, may be just holding community and space with each other, like we are here. That doesn't immediately produce the world we demand and dream, but it does give us enough succor and sustenance to maybe make it one more night and arise to fight again.
Thank you. I think we needed that. We're going to transition now to some Q&A. Do we have a mic that's out there, or how are we doing this? Yeah, we do have one on the floor here. Yeah, so do we have questions in the room? And then we'll go to questions from the chat.
Okay? Yeah, there we go. So this, I hope this is not now anticlimactic. It's more of a piece of information than it is a question. Students for Justice in Palestine at Columbia posted just a little bit ago that Union, where I am a student of Dr. Dorrien's and a classmate of Benz's, has become the first U.S. Institute of Higher Learning to fully divest. So their board voted today to divest from all companies profiting from the genocide in Palestine. So in terms of things that change in little tiny pieces, that felt like something to share with this group, that there's at least some pieces of things that are happening. So that's the information. But I also, when you introduced Plenty Good Room, you talked about the importance of that phrase as being connected to the solidarity economy. And I'm wondering what we're seeing with the conjoining of law enforcement and the military violence in multiple places. Is there a flip side to that is a solidarity economy, right? What would that moral imagination, what would that look like? Do you write about that in terms of a solidarity economy that might not just be local, but international?
Really appreciate that question. Michelle? Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm recognizing that up to this point, I have not said much about solidarity economics, so I appreciate the opportunity to say a bit more here. I talk a bit about and I think I may have mentioned this in the introduction, I'm not sure, Gary and Benz can keep me honest here. The New Economy Coalition, for instance, which talks about things like credit unions, community land trusts, public banks, highlighting models that are scaling slowly, but nevertheless building worker cooperatives. We might point to those, sovereign wealth funds, those that have some democratic input involved in them, which are not all of them. Those kinds of models that allow for more community ownership, more co-determination workers on boards, and other kinds of concrete steps towards a more socialist way of doing things. That's happening in the States. Some of those federations do cut across borders internationally. The International Labor Organization has a kind of which is a part of the United Nations, has a designation called Solidarity and Social Economics that highlights some of the efforts happening in different nation states. And so I would maybe point to them as well as another kind of source that highlights solidarity economics and is the flip side of some of the policy transfer happening in terms of policing.
Yes. Well, quite a few of those books of mine that Ben's mercifully didn't mention do run rather long on just this subject I've been writing. In 1986, I wrote a book called The Democratic Socialist Vision, and the last time Andrew and I were here, and in this church, in this very stage, it was to talk about my book, American Democratic Socialism. Both of these books run long, and quite a few of them in between, about expanding the cooperative sector and variations on the Meidner Plan and mix and match models and all these things. So, of course, I believe in all these things that the New Economy Coalition talks about and the like. I can get pretty wonky on this if you need. And yet I would say one sort of cautionary thing about it, because there were times earlier in my life when I thought, oh, we've got it to a certain point, and I just think it should just keep going like this, just by virtue of its own kind of momentum, right? And yet you kind of hit this plateau of just how many actual cooperatives, I mean, anything like producer cooperatives we even have in this country, because indeed, a certain amount of exhortation and people pulling together and just against the teeth of the kind of society that we're in can get you to the point where we've been for the past 15 years, for goodness sake. And yet with no growth beyond that point. Why? Because we're never going to get above what the ceiling has been without banks that don't hate cooperatives. And until you have truly, public banks or mutual funded banks that actually like cooperatives, that want to see them expand, you just can't get beyond the certain point where we've been stuck, really since the Occupy years. I mean, the kind of when you do a kind of survey of kind of the lay of the land on this subject, it's not that much different now than it was 15 years ago. And that's not for lack of a whole lot of people pulling together and saying, let's turn it into a cooperative, let's hold on to something we have before it runs to Mexico or Taiwan or something like that. I mean, that model, yes, there's just ongoing organizing work about all of that that's just utterly necessary. But it's not as though there's been a lack of it. There's been tremendous amount of activity that's gone into just holding us where we are. But a breakthrough requires a different kind of financial system than the one we've got.
The other thing I might note there, that yay and amen to all of what Gary just mentioned. There is an increasing appetite, and you see it in places like Dissent magazine, even a nonprofit quarterly, to have these kind of conversations about solidarity economics, the interests in modern monetary theory, which that could take us down a long rabbit hole, but I think it's promising insofar as it is emblematic of a willingness to have harder, clearer conversations about public finance, about monetary policy, and the role of ethically resourcing justice work, which has not historically been a strength of the left, of any persuasion, while at the same time, I think Gary's point is spot on, regardless of what new vista of argument and research and pilot projects and demonstration efforts. As long as we have the current financial system that we have, it will be tough to find the philanthropic and public investment and the little bit of family foundations and individual donor money that we might want to have to do this kind of work.
So my question is, what does the Black social gospel tradition and how is it evolving? Oh, okay. What does the Black social justice, social gospel tradition have to say to the climate emergency and the need for climate justice?
Beautiful question. What does the Black social gospel tradition have to say to the climate? Want to lift up a few initiatives and organizations that I think are doing powerful and rich work in this space. I think of Karen Baker Fletcher's work, which I think is really rich on ecological streams of justice. I think the AME tradition has, those who work within it, I should say, have had a lot to say about questions of justice, including environmental justice. And I'm thinking of a couple of folks in particular whose names I'll note, that among the many things that they do, they I think are doing great work on this. Reverend Dr. Nakia Robert, who started Abolitionist Sanctuary, folks like Reverend Stephen Green, I think have really spoke to the multidimensionality of Black social gospel work. So would definitely call them in this space. Another group that comes to mind that I would lift up, and I think is relevant here. I've known a lot of Black churches to be deeply engaged with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. When I was at Allen Cathedral, I worked with a number of congregations, labor unions, and others to organize around some waste equity bills that were moving in the New York City Council. And so I think that while the measured pacing of my response suggests that it may not be as prominent as other streams and traditions of justice, there are nevertheless, I think, a lot of folks that are working in this space. And my not being able to name them off the top of my head, I don't think is necessarily a reflection of folks not doing great work in this space.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. So I'm going to sneak in two questions before we go to the online audience. So the first, Plenty Good Room. You know, many people on the left advocate for open borders. A lot of churches are doing migrant ministry. This church is, many other churches. Benz was at the border recently and going back again, I believe. So how do we make enough room and not, but the capitalist system pits different constituencies against each other. You know, it's like, oh, they're going to replace us. I mean, for white people, they're going to replace us for people in the working class, people who are holding on to their jobs by a thread, they're going to work for less, or whatever, whatever the propaganda is about it. But how do you see the black social gospel, and how do you see churches responding to this? And then back to the solidarity economy, I don't know really anything about this. My understanding is that the Episcopal Diocese is beginning to think about, or has even started, a credit union in the Bronx. So again, these seem like small things. I mean, I'd rather have a state bank. I'd rather have all the post offices serving as banks, but is there a role for churches to pool their money and to show the way and kind of be the pilot programs that maybe the Ford Foundation might have funded or something, but instead the churches might fund something like that could then be pointed to as saying, this is a really good program, it works, there should be legislation around this. So anyway.
Firstly, this migrant crisis is an opportunity for religious communities to rediscover why they exist. And some of them are doing so. And this is very much a fluid thing. We're so new in this. This crisis itself is so recently upon us that we'll have to see. Is it going to be able to scale up even to what, say, the sanctuary movement was in the mid-1980s, which ended up being a rather considerable thing, and beginning from origins that I remember how humble they were by comparison to what that became. So this could be like that, and I've seen, evidence of it here and there. I mean, goodness, Michelle here in the back row, she's involved. Michelle is involved in a church-based group that dealt with just the front end piece of this, just the meeting the people when they get off the bus. And for a while, as these buses were arriving, you didn't know when and from where. It was just like, but there's just this immediacy right in front of you. Well, that's all something that had to be organized. Now, what's the cooperation between the mutual aid groups and the churches and whoever else just the day before yesterday entered this picture in order to be able to say, yes, I'll do something? How you even organize that kind of aid, that's going on in all the cities right now that are being impacted by the arrival of these buses. And it's a similar thing here as well. I just did a project yesterday with someone from Central Synagogue here in Manhattan, which is deeply involved in doing migrant work here at basically with two kind of former hotels having certain responsibility. So right now it's being divvied up in these kind of piecemeal things, because indeed this is so hands-on that you're just trying to survive this onrush. And yet if you can step back from it even a little bit, get some sense of the scale of it. Meanwhile, everyone who's involved in this group has got a kind of love-hate relationship with the powers that be in the cities who are doing the minimum and not very cooperative, but yet doing something, and you're trying to get more out of them. And in both cases, on both ends of it, you got just the problem of the sheer temporal swiftness of it, that something we weren't even talking about a couple of years ago is now such an immense crisis all around us. But it certainly is an opportunity for religious congregations.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that, or maybe a couple of things. One is that both on the border and in cities, we are essentially running citizen, or I should say resident, humanitarian aid campaigns in the absence of government, on a scale that is quite significant, and it is an opportunity for churches to be involved. It is, to say the least, a very obvious piece of theology for churches to be involved in supporting their new neighbors. But the other thing I want to say about that briefly is how it again is a point of sort of connection between issues, like what Eric Adams likes to call the migrant crisis here in New York City is largely, it's not a crisis that migrants have caused, it is a housing crisis, right? It is a housing crisis, and if you want to go a little bit deeper than that, it is a problem of commodification of housing, but particularly in New York City, right? The cost of housing is such, the new arrivals have other problems, but it's really a housing crisis. So it's like, again, the intersection of all those things. So I just wanted to mention that, but I didn't want to, I wanted Andrew to have a chance to say something too.
No, you both have said so much. In fact, so much that I would return to an earlier question about which I said very little. The Black Church Food Security Network comes to mind as an organization that is doing a lot of work on environmental justice. Reverend Dr. Heber Brown's organization and the Hip Hop Caucus, which is something that Reverend Lennox Yearwood has been leading for some time and has been a strong supporter of environmental justice efforts, Green New Deal, and all the rest. To the second part of Maxine's question, which we haven't talked about as much, we'll lean in there on credit unions, which are at their best pockets of non-predatory financial support that can help to provide a space for pooling together resources, helping people through a pinch, resourcing the work of organizations in rich ways. But credit unions, I think, need to be paired, as we mentioned earlier, with other community development financial institutions, moving banks in a much more equitable direction, as Gary mentioned, and a few other things that we could spend an extended amount of time talking about. The one other thing that I'll maybe note here that I think is an opportunity for congregations that hasn't yet been seized to the degree that perhaps it could. I think a lot of the reproduction of mental models of capitalism, at least in Black churches, that I can speak to that maybe with the most precision, has been around questions of financial education, which are very in-your-face, understandable questions of what do you do when retirement comes, or what do you do when questions of unemployment come, or what do you do as it relates to caring for oneself, for one's parents, for one's children, et cetera. The emphasis on save, spend, invest in proportionate ways has sometimes led folks to reach for a Dave Ramsey curriculum, or folks whose view of capitalism and of politics and personal finance is held at bay because it may meet some immediate needs. And so it's kind of like the purported cure is worse than the disease, and even the cure itself is like kind of not really a cure. And so having more holistic models of what some have called critical financial education as a kind of interpersonal intervention that talks about some of what we're naming here in terms of solidarity economics, as well as the need to have a movement and political solution as well to pair with the financial piece, so that we don't end up in a space where we are self-loathing or blaming ourselves for what behavior alone or even institutional actions alone, if we don't have macroeconomic shifts, won't quite get us to.
We have. Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Carol. Thank you all for this conversation. It's incredibly not fun, but exciting. I want to bring two things into the room. One is Heather McGee and the idea of the zero-sum mentality, which I think ties into solidarity economics. Like when you talk, Gary, about we're constantly hitting this wall, this roof, and we seem to get pushed back by something. I think the unspoken something so far tonight is white supremacy, is the idea of is the scarcity mentality that's been mentioned, and the idea that if I share, there won't be enough. There's a limited amount to go around, and therefore I need to get what I need in order to secure myself, right? The white supremacy part, I think, is, I think that connects what we see in Gaza, what we see in violence against especially Black and brown students here in the United States. And I think that we have to name that as part of what we need to be addressing to dismantle. If we're going to create something different, we have to look at all of the things that are supporting the status quo now that we want to change. The other piece I just wanted to mention is the existence already in immigrant communities of communal banking that's been going on for generations and generations. Newly arrived folks who figure out how to pool their resources and source members who need it, and the give back and mutuality already exists. So maybe churches can think about looking at that and learning, as along with wanting to be an example and here's how to. I'm trying to gently call for a moment of humility, like step back before coming in as an example and really learn what's already happening that you're just not a part of. And it's okay to not know. But don't assume because you don't know it doesn't exist, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I feel like the racial part, the white supremacist part, I don't quite know how to articulate it perfectly, but it feels missing, and it feels gaping in its missing in tonight's conversation. I would love to be, like, here. If you think that's not true, I want to hear that. And if you think it plays a part, how does it tie in?
It did just happen that way. We didn't have talk about, white supremacy. It's a structure of power based on privilege that presumes to define what's normal, right? And so then, of course, it just affects everything else that we've talked about, because we're always underneath it and fighting it off, except, and fighting battles over it that are sometimes more comfortably named in other ways. So perhaps there was some of the latter tonight, although I think it's mostly just a question of presuming, certainly up here, that we know about what is at stake over this particular structure of power. But it also includes but extends beyond just that, because you named something, the scarcity mentality, that isn't just about this. I mean, white supremacy engages it like nothing else. I mean, mobilizes it like nothing else. And yet the scarcity, my goodness, entire civilizations, empires have risen and fallen over just the availability of water. Water is scarce. If you can make it available to certain people, well, that's the basis of your power. And so then you get whole civilizations where people just think it's embedded in human nature that people have this great fearfulness about the availability of water. Until what? Until, some parts of little bits of history here and there, some places, they actually socialize water. And it turns out it's not part of human nature at all. It's just part of, what's requisite in the system. And this used to be a parable that you would take and say, well, if there, why not health care? Why not, other things that are essential human goods? They're not part of human nature either, and neither is white supremacy. It's every bit as artificial and trumped up and created out of just sheer greed and will to power, because it had benefited the group that invented it. But that, it's not like it's just some given in human nature that we have to be resigned to. A better system, and you'd get better human beings engaging the system. But the problem with my little analogy here, and some of you are probably feeling it right now, is that, we can't even say about that about water anymore. I mean, the battle for water that isn't scarce has become far more embattled now than it used to be, and we can see that we're staring into a future where indeed struggling over water might again become part of human nature in our part of the world, because that's the world we're heading into.
Really great points. We'll just note that, and maybe note explicitly, I think talking about racial capitalism is a way to implies a bit about white supremacy, and but we'll state more forthrightly here that I certainly think that white supremacy is a part of what frustrates attempts to have a plenty good room society. You spoke about Heather McGhee's work, and certainly in The Sum of Us, how racism costs us the ability for everybody to have nice things, public goods that are decommodified and accessible to all. McGhee essentially argues, among other things, that white supremacy is the fault line that fractures all of our movements. And think McGhee is spot on about that. The only thing that I would add further, and I'm thinking of Sharice Burton-Stelly's work here, and talking about how racial capitalism is built on moments of primitive accumulation, stolen land, stolen labor, and using ideologies and narratives of whiteness to kind of chase down all of this exploitation and extraction. And so in that sense, to not name the role that white supremacy plays in the production and primitive accumulation moments of racial capitalism is not to maybe fully narrate, perhaps, in ways that are comprehensive what's happened. So appreciate you lifting that point up, and the chance to maybe elaborate a bit further there.
All right. I think we are just about at the end of our time, and I want to invite Maxine up in a moment to sort of close us out with a word. But first, I want to thank Gary Dorrien and Andrew Wilkes for an absolutely fascinating conversation. It's been an honor and a privilege to share this space with you. So thank you. And Maxine, you have the last word.
This has been such a rich conversation, and I want to thank Judson. Can you hear me? Okay. They have to do media training. No, hold. Okay, hold up here. Okay. Well, let me say again, Benz, we are so grateful to you for the questions, grateful to Andrew, to Gary, grateful to Judson Church. And I'll just say that there is a donation box back there. Judson has donated the space, the tech people, the security guard downstairs, so anything we can do to help defray that cost. And I want to thank Devin from New York DSA, from the Religion and Socialism group, who was running the live stream, and Jake, who's been running the tech, from which we will be getting a podcast. So if you missed some of this, or you want to go over it, we will be releasing that. And encourage everyone, this is a church, so we're not really having a coffee hour afterward, but there is some food, and so socialize. I'm holding it, yeah, oh golly. Okay, anyway, maybe you can hear me. Thank you all for coming. If you're not a member of DSA, or you're not on our mailing list and you want to be, I mean, you don't have to join DSA right this second, but you could sign the mailing list out there, and we will send notices of other meetings. And thank you all. We'll continue the conversation again. And I guess that's it. Oh, last thing, the chairs need to go back. So they can go over there. This space, as you can see, is used for many, many things. And the chairs stack nicely. So get some, stack the chairs and have something to eat and drink. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Good night.